Hello, my name is Dave Litton. I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about air quality in pretty general terms and with a little bit of emphasis on suspended particulate matter. In Allegheny County, air quality is the responsibility of the Allegheny County Health Department. It measures, reports, forecasts air quality index for measurements at 17 monitoring locations throughout the county. While there are a number of pollutants that are used to calculate the air quality index, such as CO, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, PM10, that's particulate matter less than 10 micrometers in diameter, ozone, and PM2.5, which is particulate matter less than 2.5 microns in diameter. The two most important ones are ozone and PM2.5, and that's where most of the information that we get comes from. This is just a reiteration of what I just said. The air quality index is divided into about 6 different categories. When we see a green or a good category, that means that the air quality index is less than 50. As the number increases, it goes from moderate to unhealthy to very unhealthy, all the way up to hazardous. And within each category, there are different levels of gases or particulate matter that these levels correspond to. The EPA has devised a rather elaborate formula for assessing air quality index based upon the actual concentrations that are measured. If you go to a section of the EPA website called Air Now, you can actually find what's called an air quality index calculator. And there's a couple of different ways you can use this. You can either put in the gas or pollutant like particulate matter, PM2.5, that you're interested in, the concentration that's being measured, and then it will give you the air quality index and whether it's good, bad, or very bad. The other side of that is you can actually put in the air quality index that you see perhaps that's being reported, like if it's 55 or 60, and it will give you the corresponding ozone or PM2.5 level that corresponds to. So if I were to use this, we could talk a little bit about if I were to stick in a number like 25 for the air quality index. Well, that would mean that either the ozone is 27 parts per billion or PM2.5 is about 6 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, as you go up, the proportionate level of ozone or particulate matter does not necessarily go up by the same factor. So for instance, at 125, even though that's 5 times the AQI of 25, you're only up about a factor of 3 in ozone and about a factor of 7 in a little bit more than 5 for the PM2.5. If you go up to 250, where you're 10 times as high, instead of being 10 times 27, you're 153, but the PM matter is actually 200 micrograms per cubic meter, which is considerably more than 10 times. So both of these scales are nonlinear, is my point. So let's talk about fine particulate matter for a minute. And in particular, we're talking about PM2.5. And these are the fine particles that are emitted directly or formed in the air from gases, such as the smog that you might see. These are just some slides, sort of a collage showing where they might come from: wood burning, power plants, heavy-duty equipment, traffic, all sorts of different sources and that produce these fine particulates. Now, when we're talking about this, what we're talking about really is that they measure mass. So it's all the mass that's less than, with particles less than diameter of 2.5 microns. So wood burning fireplaces and stoves, forest fires, hydraulic fracturing, these are all sources. And one of the things about this is that they often produce different particle sizes, but they're all lumped together as PM2.5. So just to show you, I'm sure you've seen all this black smoke spewing from a diesel engine, power plants, such as a couple located within Allegheny County, one up at Cheswick, and there's another one, a couple more. Forest fires, wildland fires produce a lot of not only CO2 but also soot and smoke, particulate matter that gets into the atmosphere. Wood burning. Wood burning is a particularly kind of hazard because a lot of people burn wood for heating or outside activities without very much thinking about the consequences. And wood's particularly a problem because the particles can be very, very small. And you can actually burn a lot of wood, never see anything, but there's a lot of stuff out there that gets into your body, into your lungs that you breathe. Not just gases, but the fine particulate matter as well. Hydraulic fracturing is another source of particulate matter and other pollutants. There's a lot of concern, for instance, not just about pollution, but also about emission of some of the greenhouse gases, such as methane, that escapes during the process. So how big are these particles? Well, they're not very big. And this sort of puts it in perspective. There's a human hair, and within the cross-section of that human hair, or the diameter, you can place 5 particles that are diameter 10 microns. And within each one of those 10 micron particles, you could actually place 4 across the diameter of the PM2.5. So they're very, very small. And on the left side, it gives you an idea as to how big a grain of sand might be from the beach. If you've ever been to the beach and thought about how big the grains of sand are, they're about 90 microns, which is considerably larger than the particles that we're breathing in. So why are these particles so harmful? Well, they're so harmful primarily because they are ingested into, or breathed into, the respiratory system. The big particles, those that are typically less or larger than about 2.5 to 5 microns, somewhere in that neighborhood, get scrubbed out in the nose and mouth and the upper respiratory system, upper parts of the respiratory system. Those that are larger than or smaller than about 2.5 micrometers make it into the bronchial tract and eventually into the alveolar regions of the lung, which are the deepest regions of the lung, where most of the transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place with the blood. And so when these particles get inside, they stick, and the body, the lung, or the respiratory system retains them, and the retention is usually expressed in terms of the particle size. So this is some data from, I can't remember the source right now, but it shows you sort of an overview as to where the particles are deposited in what sections of the lung. When you're out in very large particles, say less than a micron or so, then they're usually deposited in the extrathoracic part, or the nose and mouth. Okay, and that would be the dashed lines here. Okay, when you get into the bronchial system, you get a little bit more penetration of the smaller particles, but still the larger ones are the ones that are predominantly deposited in this area. It's when you get in the alveolar regions of the lung, these particles here are the very, very tiny ones, the ones that are, in my opinion, probably the most nefarious, get deposited. And they don't just get deposited, they get deposited with a very high efficiency. So when you're down here at 20, 30 nanometers, you're talking at least 50, 40, 50, 60% of every 100 particles that go in, 40 or 50 or 60 of them get deposited in the lung. And that's huge. And this is sort of just another embodiment of that. It shows that when you're about 50 nanometers in diameter, you're about 45% deposited, and it keeps increasing as the particle size decreases. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the large particles get scrubbed out, but they get scrubbed out and deposited not in the lung, but in the upper regions of the respiratory tract. So what do they look like? Well, they vary all over the place. Here are some Sahara dust, sand. These are smoldering smoke particles. Most of these appear to be spherical. Here's a smoke cluster. This one's obtained from the Amazon, apparently. We hear a lot about pollution in China, Beijing. Here's some particles that were collected and imaged from China. And you can see here's 1 micron. You can see how small these little guys are. If this is 1 micron, then this has got to be at least maybe 10 to 20% of that. So they're like 10, 20, 30 nanometers in size. Very, very, very small. So where I used to work at NIOSH. We did a lot of work with trying to figure out what some of these particles look like. The idea was to make a whole bunch of measurements, which we did, take some photographs, which we did, and then compare the measurements with the photographs to see if we could actually predict what the structure of some of these particles look like. And this is what the lab looked like. We had a little area over here where we actually generated particles from either smoldering or flaming fires. And we didn't know if different fires, different types of fires, or different materials that were burning produced different types of particles. So that was one of the things we wanted to look at. So we produce them here, we flow them into this chamber here, which is basically just what we call the smoke box or smoke chamber. And from there we would take samples and flow them to different instruments. This is a mass measuring, particulate mass measuring device. Inside the box we had some gas analyzers, 2 or 3 or 4, CO, NO, we had HCl, we had some sulfur H2S and SO2 sensors, and a couple more inside. Then we also flowed samples to some other devices where we looked at the radiative transfer, the scattering and extinction of the particles as a function of the mass of the concentration that we would measure with this guy over here. And back here there's a whole bunch of other instrumentation that we used. So for purposes of this talk, basically we're just interested in looking at some of the pictures that we got and what they look like. So this is a particle from burning coal, and since it doesn't make any difference where you burn the coal in the lab or whether you burn it basically in a power plant, you're going to get basically the same particles. And even though there's not a scale on here, we found that these little particles, the very, very tiny ones here, run somewhere between 20 and 30 nanometers in diameter. But then they all join together to form what's called an aggregate particle. And depending upon the degree or efficiency of the combustion process, you get particles that sort of just touch when you're very efficient with your combustion, or when you're not so efficient, like smoldering, or you're overburning with too much fuel, you'll get clumped particles. And I think we have some photographs of some of those. This is just another flaming particle. This is basically the same size. You can see that this size right here is about 30 nanometers. So these particles here are probably about 25 nanometers in diameter. Very, very tiny particles, but they form a larger particle. Okay. This is a particle from a smoldering fire. You can see that they're not linked together the same way. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of clumping. So you typically get that from fires that are burning fuel rich. Probably don't know what that means, but it means there's an abundance of fuel and not enough oxygen to make it completely burn. Here's just some other slides from the same set of experiments. These are all non-flaming fires, and you can see you can get really a lot of clumping, almost become spherical, more clumping from fires that don't flame, whereas from the fires that really do flame, you can see it's pretty consistent, regardless of the type of material you're burning, that they all produce these little very tiny particles, and they sort of coagulate or chain themselves together to form a much larger particle. So we call these particles, any one of these particles, we call them they're like a fractal. We call them fractal-like. I think the terminology these days is to call them fractal aggregates, but fractal-like or fractal aggregates doesn't make any difference. But we measured their properties. And you can see that when you have a flaming particle, and this is for a whole bunch of tests, this is probably 80 or 90 experiments all lumped together here. You see that on the average you get about the very, very tiny particles are about 24 nanometers in diameter. That's very, very small. For non-flaming, they're about little over 3 times as big, or like 85 on the average, 85 nanometers in diameter. But you see the size of the particle, the size of the aggregate is many times typically the size of an individual particle. So even though you only have 24 here, the extent or the size of the particle is like 148. And there's a bunch of particles attached to this. On the average, we found that there were a little over 1,100 tiny particles attached to an aggregate if it's a flaming, but for the clumping ones, it was only about 95 on the average. And then the optical properties are also of interest, not so much from our perspective in terms of health or pollution, but from a climate or radiative transfer point. And that is that when you have these flaming particles, that they absorb a lot more energy. Their absorption coefficient, which is the amount of energy they absorb per unit mass concentration, is about a factor of 6 or 7 times the amount of energy they absorb when they're non-flaming. So this is just some data. Probably doesn't mean a lot to you, but it's the kind of data you need to understand what the particles are. So how do we measure these particles? We know they're out there. We know that we get adverse health effects from them. You can actually see them sometimes you can't. So what are some of the instruments and devices we use for measuring them? The standard technique, since most of the data is in terms of mass, are filter techniques, where you actually collect the particulates on a filter. You weigh the filter before, you weigh it after. The difference is how much mass has been deposited, and you know the time and the flow rate at which you collected the sample, or you should, and from that you can calculate the mass concentration over a certain period of time. That's more or less a static technique because you have a filter in place, and then you have to wait till the end to see the results. There are some dynamic filter techniques, ones in particular use in the U.S. called a tapered element oscillating microbalance. It's a TEOM, T-E-O-M, somewhere here. And that's just a device that deposits particles on a filter, but the filter vibrates. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Then there are some other techniques. Optical techniques are probably the ones that are most widely used, where you use either scattering or attenuation at discrete wavelengths and angles to measure the concentration. One of the nice things about the optical technique is that the optical signal scales with the mass concentration. As particle sizes increase, the mass of particles increase. Same thing with the optical techniques. The optical techniques work quite well too because they scale in the same way. There are other techniques called ionization techniques. One of these is a beta attenuation technique that actually does mass measurements. And there's another technique that we use. It's called a certain type of diffusion charging, either bipolar or unipolar, where we're able to measure the very small particles with that kind of technique. There we go. So in the dynamic filter, the TEOM is a tapered element oscillating microbalance, and basically what it does, pulls a sample into this filter, deposits particles on the filter, and this little guy here oscillates at a fixed frequency, and when that frequency changes because of mass on the filter, you get a readout of the mass that's been deposited on the filter. That's sort of the schematic. In terms of the what it actually looks like in real life, this is what a picture of it, a real device looks like. The actual tapered element sits inside the long tube at the top of the instrument. The rest of it's basically electronics and processing. Okay, some optical techniques and devices. The basic optical technique is one that uses light scattering, where you have a laser or other light source, shines a light through a volume. This would be the volume. And then you look at light that's scattered from that volume by particles at some fixed angle or angles. That's the way it sort of is able to look at the number of particles. Typically, a lot of simple devices these days measure the scattering at 60 degrees. It doesn't make a lot of difference, except for the fact that at the smaller angles you get more signal, but it's also sometimes difficult to separate out the smaller angles because of the interference from the light source, especially if it's a very bright, like a laser light source. Here's a couple of examples of optical particle detectors, counters, monitors. Something you can buy something that's very expensive and very complex, or you can get something that's fairly inexpensive. But the technique or the idea behind its operation basically remains unchanged. The little device, the optical scattering chamber like this, has been put into a couple of instruments. One locally here is the spec sensor. You can see it sitting inside. And then the LED or LCD display, which is this face right here. I think there's an updated version of this. This is an old photograph, but the idea is basically the same. So, as I said before, I mean, you can use optical particle monitors or counters. Some of them count, some of them sort of try to measure the total concentrations. One of the drawbacks to them is the fact that they are not very sensitive to the very small particles, the very tiny particles. And we've acquired some data. This is data that we acquired in the lab that sort of shows how the response changes as a function of the size. So if you have particles that are 50 nanometers in diameter all the way up to roughly, I think this is like 200 nanometers in this range right here, 200 to 300. If you plot the ratio of the actual number of particles to the particles that the device tells you is there, you can see that way down here, even you're measuring like 250 times as many particles to 300 times as many particles as the device is telling you. So it becomes relatively very inefficient as the particle size begins to decrease. As the particle size continues above here, then these numbers get closer and closer to 1. So what you're really reading with a very sophisticated number counting device, with the inexpensive optical particle counters, or any optical particle counter for that matter, is very good out in this region. Back here, it's not so good. So, where am I here? So, filter and optical methods are heavily weighted towards larger particles because they weigh more and they scatter light better. Ultrafine particles are not counted equitably as a component of PM2.5, but ultrafines are those particles that penetrate most deeply into the lung and may be responsible for many of the most severe adverse health effects. So if we're really going to look at the impact of particulate matter on health, we need to devise ways to measure these devices, or these particles, these very, very small ones, with some sort of devices that are fairly inexpensive, and usable by a lot of people. You can buy devices that do this, but you're going to pay a lot of money, and most of them are not wearable or able to be used by a normal person, which I assume most of us are. Okay, so here's part of the problem. For instance, with these guys, you can see here that this is wood smoke, and this is a lot of data over long periods of time, different places, different locations, but this is all sampled from the atmosphere, and you can see that doesn't make any difference exactly where you are along here. You're still going to end up with particles that are predominantly less than about 200 nanometers. This is 200 nanometers right here. Most of them peak around 100 nanometers. A lot of particles back in here. Not so many when you get way out here. Now there's more mass out here because the particles are larger, but there's not as many particles. So there's a lot of particles in here, and that translates into a lot of surface area. So the question becomes, how do you do that? How can you measure those very small particles, especially those that are less than about 350 or 200 nanometers, somewhere in that range of diameter? Well, we did it once before with a ionization optical sensor, where we were able to combine the techniques of optical scattering with the techniques of diffusion charging. It was basically a modified $20 smoke sensor. And in the $20 modified smoke sensor, we had an optical sensor and we had an ion sensor, which is very, very sensitive to the particles less than about 100 to 200 nanometers in diameter. And inside this device, we actually had two chambers. The top chamber was what's called an ion chamber. It's it's in a smoke sensor, probably one that you may have in your home. But it has a little small source of americium-241. Nothing to worry about unless you end up having to eat it, which is probably not going to happen. But inside this little chamber, you can measure the numbers of very, very small particles all the way down to 5 or 10 nanometers without too much difficulty. To compensate for particles at the high end, you also want to measure how many there are of them as well. This is a simple scattering chamber. This one happened to operate at a 45-degree angle. But it was both contained inside this little box, this little smoke detector that could be mounted in your ceiling at home. Inside, this is sort of what it looked like. This was the optical scattering chamber. This was the little ionization chamber. And this is about the size of a quarter, this right here. We built several of these for a project looking at particulate matter inside homes in developing countries where they use open flames for heating and cooking. And what we did is we made a belt wearable one. It's actually in this little pouch right here that you could wear around your neck. And this is sort of what it looks like in some of these homes. I think this is a home in India, since a lot of the stuff that we did was in India. You can see there are actually open flames down here generating a lot of black smoke up here. But this person here that's doing it is subjected to this smoke day in and day out. And over a period of time, it takes its toll, resulting in premature deaths and a lot of adverse health problems. So you want to try to get rid of that smoke. But, okay, so in order to figure out where you are, what we did is we calibrated the device over a fairly large particle size range with very tiny particles and larger particles. Our particles were as small as about 45 nanometers and as large as about 800 nanometers. And basically what we did is we plotted the optical response or the ionization response. Okay, and when we got above a certain point, we could only use one set of data. We would get, when we were down in here, we would use the ionization chamber response. When we were up In the larger size range, we would use the optical sensor response. And that way we could determine which particles were smaller, which particles were larger, just based upon the ratio of the two signals. We could do this. That was for this was for the mass concentration. We could also do the same for surface area. So for the surface area, when this ratio changed, when the delta CeV over the voltage was very high, then that corresponded to smaller particles, and just the reverse for the optical particles. So right now we're looking at the CMU Create Lab to look at this technology, hopefully to build some that can be made available to measure both PM2.5 and the ultrafine portion. And we know that we have other places in the world that are looking at them, both in the U.S. and Europe, similar development programs to try to get the ultrafine particles as part of the overall measurement for air quality, and in particular as it relates to particulate matter. Some conclusions from this: current devices, especially the inexpensive ones that are available now, measure particulate mass levels or optical signals that can correlate directly with mass. Ultrafine particles, these are the very, very tiny ones, are not counted properly, but are the particles that penetrate deeply into the lung, and we think may be responsible for the most severe health effects. Air quality indices need to be evaluated to give proper weight to these smaller particles, and devices need to be developed to provide this capability in order to be able to better define and measure air quality. One of the things, going back to this second point here, where air quality needs to be reevaluated to give proper weight to smaller particles, is that there was a recent study that came out discussing the adverse health and premature morbidity that results from suspended particulate matter, PM2.5, that's actually 6 micrograms per cubic meter and less. And if you remember one of the earlier slides, it said that if the air quality is good, it's 6 micrograms per cubic meter. Well, apparently that number is not cast in concrete. So we need to think a little bit about how we're going to include some of the smaller particles. And that's the end.